Hi, everyone, this is the Encyclopedia Channel, and the book that this program interprets for you is Asking the Right Questions, A Guide to Critical Thinking. The question here has a clear direction, which is the so-called critical thinking. The purpose is to help everyone become a critical thinker, so as to ask questions better, discuss their views better, and understand the world better. Critical thinking is not an alien concept to us. In the current chaotic and noisy information age, we are exposed to huge and diverse information that is difficult to distinguish between true and false every day. Various media are constantly pushing important, unimportant, necessary, and non-essential. Took up too much of our attention. Who do you trust? Who to question? Is their evidence credible? Is the conclusion of the question unique? What is your own point of view behind these questions? What is your reason? Living in such an era of information explosion, we all know that we can't listen to one side and believe it all, and we can't accept all the information. Critical thinking, as a thinking tool to deal with complex information, has also been shouted for many years. But what exactly is critical thinking? How to think critically? Not everyone knows what to do. Listening to this lecture is like a practical guide, teaching you step by step how to become a critical thinker, asking key questions, and letting the debates of different opinions be resolved. The book has two authors, Neil Brown and Stuart Keeley. Among them, Neil Brown is an economics professor who has published many books. He has made great achievements in the field of critical thinking and is the main speaker of the International Critical Thinking Conference. All universities provide critical thinking training and counseling services. So he is a very professional person who provides critical thinking training and consulting services. This book was first published in 1978. Up to now, 12 editions have been released one after another. Today we are talking about the latest edition. In this version, there are many new additions, such as how critical thinkers should speak and write in addition to asking questions, which we will also mention in the interpretation. Next, we will use 3 parts to interpret this book for you. First of all, what is critical thinking and why should we cultivate this kind of critical thinking, fall into the trap of erroneous thinking? First part. First, what is critical thinking? Critical thinking is not a new concept. Most people have a vague impression of critical thinking. But if I ask you, what exactly is critical thinking? You may find that it's a little confusing. There are also many people who have a misunderstanding of critical thinking, thinking that critical thinking is to doubt everything, criticize everything, and to catch the pigtails in other people's words and criticize them, but this is not the case. Regarding the definition of critical thinking, the book says this: to listen and read critically is to systematically evaluate and respond to everything that one hears and sees. Just like panning for gold among the complicated information, critical thinking emphasizes thinking, analyzing and testing information, and then selectively believing and absorbing it. In order to better understand critical thinking, let's first understand sponge thinking. The so-called sponge thinking means that in the face of the information provided to us by the outside world, we absorb it like a sponge and acquire knowledge easily and effortlessly. Absorbing external knowledge is the starting point of all our learning, but this way of thinking has a fatal flaw, that is, we only absorb it passively, without the link of evaluation and judgment, which cannot cultivate our ability of independent thinking. If you read, believe what we see, we will only become a marionette. Critical thinking, in contrast, is a gold-digging attitude. It is to regard the process of reading and listening as a process of panning for gold. What others say is a mixture of gold and stones. What we have to do is to listen and read with an attitude of constant questioning. When the other party sells his point of view to you, you don't just accept it blindly, but hold a mentality of debating with the other party at any time, constantly pick and choose, ask questions and think about the answers to the questions. Compared with sponge thinking, critical thinking allows us to take the initiative and get the most reasonable answers. A critical thinker is not stubborn and arguing, it is not unthinking criticism or arguing, but a rational mind to screen, evaluate and judge information, respond to it, and draw its own conclusions. The ancient Greek philosopher Socrates was a person who especially liked to ask questions. When he discussed problems with others, he often used the questioning method, also known as the Socratic method. Socrates believed that all knowledge comes from problems. Asking questions can avoid dogmatism and help us find the right answer. Critical thinking can help us distinguish right from wrong and be a sober, tolerant, and humble person. It sounds like critical thinking is actually not difficult. The difficulty is that it is difficult for us to do it all the time. In life, whether it is learning knowledge, communicating with people, handling work, or entertainment, we acquire and process a large amount of information all the time. But our brain is lazy and limited. Faced with such a large amount of information, it is easy to be lazy or limited by some thinking habits. These inertias and restrictions can easily deceive your reason when you are not aware of it. In the book Thinking, Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman divided the human thinking mode into System 1 and System 2. Among them, System 1 is fast thinking that relies on experience and intuition, which often does not consume much energy and can help us make quick decisions. System 2 is slow thinking that requires concentration and rationality, and uses our brains to make rational evaluations. Fast thinking is simple and easy, but in this mode of thinking, we are prone to various biases and mistakes, such as so-called stereotypes. It can be said that the efficiency of fast thinking is exchanged for accuracy, wisdom, rationality, and tolerance. We cannot completely get rid of these inertias and limitations of thinking. Therefore, consciously training our own critical thinking can help us avoid the traps of thinking. In short, critical thinking is to systematically think, identify, evaluate, and respond to information. In addition, we would like to emphasize 2 points regarding critical thinking. The first point to emphasize is that the foundation of critical thinking is not principles, but a wealth of knowledge. Unlike mathematics, economics, and other disciplines, critical thinking is not a tool and cannot directly solve problems. It just tells you a series of principles of thinking. It's like grammar. You learn it, which is great, but if you have a small amount of words, it's useless, and you still don't master the language. Critical thinking is not purely conceptual deduction, but seeks the outside world and seeks knowledge. Therefore, mastering critical thinking is only a matter of mastering a set of grammar, and you have to enrich your vocabulary before it can truly become your weapon. Second, critical thinking is not to prevent people from making mistakes, but to be able to correct them in time after making mistakes. The object of critical thinking is not only the words of others, but also what we say and think. That is to say, as a critical thinker, we should not only think critically about other people's words, but also apply to our own speaking and writing. Critical thinking is essentially an evolutionary process of our understanding of the world. It doesn't matter how correct you are now, what matters is the speed of error correction. This is true of others and themselves. Critical thinking is not to doubt everything and criticize everything, but to constantly reflect and evolve. Being good at thinking and judging is not an inborn ability, but it can be developed, so we can avoid being a self-deluded and copycat person through the training of critical thinking. The second part. We know what critical thinking is and the importance of having critical thinking. Next, how should we think critically and how to ask a good question? When someone else puts forward his opinion on a certain issue, and you have a different opinion, it is better to wait than to ask and refute in a hurry. The philosopher Wittgenstein once said that when two wise men talk, they always say wait a minute first. Next, what we want to talk about is how to examine the other party's point of view or how to organize your own point of view during this wait a minute time. Whether it is discourse or text, as long as the other party throws out a complete discussion, it is composed of topics, arguments, and conclusions. Then we will disassemble it and explain in detail how to think critically from these 3 parts. These are the 3 most important elements of the critical thinking training listed in the book. First, let's look at the topic. A topic is a question discussed in a person's discourse. If we want to comment on a certain piece of a person's discourse, we first need to identify the topic in his discourse before we can make a targeted response. In addition, the book also gives a very valuable point, that is, when you yourself need to speak on something, you can turn your speech into a question. When you think of a passage as a question, you can focus more, think more clearly, and make it easier for the reader or listener to understand in a more organized and understandable way that you want to discuss and what exactly is the problem being solved. For example, if you want to introduce a certain esports game that you like very much. If you write from its origin, development process, advantages and disadvantages, evaluation and suggestions, etc., readers will be submerged in long speeches and feel boring. You can replace what you want to say with a question like, what makes it such a great game? For such a specific question, you can develop an answer around it and give a targeted conclusion, making the discussion more focused and clearer. Note that a good topic must also be a clear and interesting question, which must be simple and clear, and must also arouse the curiosity and interest of the listener or reader. After talking about the topic, next, we have to enter the most important part of the argument. We all know that arguments contain reasons and evidence is used to support reasons. But what we often overlook is that there is an unspoken thing in the argument, which is called assumption. What does it mean to assume? Assumptions, those unstated beliefs in a speaker's argument that he takes for granted, are the bonds that tie his reasons to his conclusion. This is a bit abstract, so let's imagine a scene. A person said that the government should ban the production and sale of cigarettes because smoking is harmful to health. This argument process seems to be no problem, and the reason for the argument also supports the conclusion, but if you take a step forward, why does this reason support the conclusion? Is there such a point of view hidden in it, that is, the importance of physical health is higher than people's freedom of production, trading and smoking? This unspoken belief held by the speaker, which links reasons and conclusions, is called a hypothesis. Assumptions can be divided into value assumptions and descriptive assumptions. Value assumptions, as the name suggests, are the values held by the speaker. Descriptive assumptions refer to what the speaker thinks the world should be like, such as the world should be fair, such as things that have happened before will happen in the future. These two assumptions work on similar principles. Here, we take the value assumption as an example to expand on it. For example, some people discuss whether to use metal detectors to conduct security checks on students in schools. Among them, personal privacy and collective security are a set of conflicting values. In a debate contest, both sides will use strong and powerful arguments to support their conclusions, which sound reasonable. The biggest difference between them often lies in their different value assumptions for specific issues. Most of the sources of information we usually get, whether it is the media, public figures, or friends around us, rarely point out the value assumptions hidden in their opinions. In many cases, the speakers themselves may not be aware of it. So what is the use of finding the hidden value assumptions in the opponent's discussion? I don't know if you have such a feeling, that is, when someone discusses something and gives many reasons for the conclusion, it sounds reasonable, but it feels strange that it cannot be explained. What you should pay attention to is that his reasons may not be able to support his conclusions, and his unstated value assumptions are likely to be untenable. Let's take an example. For example, a person said that he has two friends. Friend A has worked hard in society after dropping out of middle school, and now he has become a wealthy businessman, while his friend B has finished college and graduate school and graduated. Later, he entered an ordinary company to work with a meager salary. So he said that his friend A is more successful than friend B, and it is useless to go to college or graduate school. In his passage, he concludes that going to college is useless, and his reason is that his friend A is richer and more successful than friend B. What is the unspoken value assumption in this passage? That is, money is the only criterion for measuring success and the usefulness of reading. If you think his assumption of values is untenable, you can question him. Why is money the only criterion, and people's character, cultivation, thinking, and vision are not taken into consideration? When we can identify the value assumptions behind the other parties or our own reasons, not only can we better understand the other party's position, but we can also better understand ourselves. Why do I have this assumption? What do I take for granted? After we have clarified the topic and conclusion, and confirmed whether the other party's hypothesis is feasible, next, we need to test the validity of the evidence. First of all, we have to distinguish whether its evidence is fact or his personal opinion. Facts are more convincing than opinions. Second, we need to judge how effective the evidence is. The sources of evidence can be divided into personal experiences, typical cases, testimonies of parties, authoritative or expert opinions, research results, etc. Personal experiences tend to make us fall into the fallacy of overgeneralization, which may not be reliable as evidence. Typical cases sound vivid and contagious, and it may not be considered strong evidence, but it is very useful and will make listeners the attention is more concentrated. the testimonies of the parties and expert opinions are not necessarily reliable. We need to be wary of so-called evidence and try to use strong evidence in our arguments. After the validity of the evidence has been tested, it comes to the conclusion. The book sets 4 standards for a good conclusion. First, the conclusion must be focused and clearly stated. Second, the conclusion must be supported by reasons and evidence, that is to say, there must be sufficient arguments, and most people must feel the reasons and evidence are convincing. Third, the conclusion should respond to the topic, that is, you cannot digress. Fourth, the conclusion should be easy for readers and audiences to know. There is a simple and easy-to-operate method, that is, after you have finished writing, find someone to read your text to ensure that the other party can easily find your point of view and conclusion. In the conclusion part, there is also a very important reminder in the book, that is, we must be alert to dichotomous thinking and try to adopt gray thinking. Dichotomous thinking is those judgments that are either black or white, right or wrong. Compared with dichotomous thinking, grayscale thinking is more in line with the complex world we live in. It emphasizes the use of yes and no answer complex questions in a unique way. For example, we can use conditional sentences to give a variety of conclusions, which is the sentence pattern of if then, which can help us draw more cautious and richer conclusions. The third part. Above, we have discussed how to think critically about other people's arguments and how to apply critical thinking to your own arguments from the 3 parts of the thesis, arguments, and conclusions in an argument. Next, there are some hints, that is, in the discussion, there may be some subtle traps, which will make people fall into the misunderstanding of thinking if they are not careful. In this part, let's talk about those little pitfalls. These are, beware of logical fallacies in arguments, beware of ambiguous words, beware of data that may deceive you, and beware of things that are omitted. First, let's talk about fallacies in arguments, that is, tricks that mess with you. There are many such tricks. We give a few examples here. First, the personal attack fallacy. This kind of trick is very common. The other party does not directly refute your reasons, but attacks you personally to distract you. This fallacy also has a commonly used name, which is, being right about people is not right about things. Another one is called the narrative fallacy, which means that when we can tell a story, and it seems to explain something, we think that is the case. For example, we saw a video in which an American police officer stopped a speeding car and shot the driver, who was an African American. Seeing this, a race-related story pops up in a lot of people's minds to explain it, but we don't really know much about this event. We don't know if the driver was in a hit-and-run, and when the police approached the car on the side of the road, it's not known what exactly he saw, and we don't know if the police here have a record of racism. We have a false assumption, and this assumption provides a possible explanation for the fact. We think the fact is so, but it may not be the case. This is a narrative fallacy. In fact, there are a lot of reversal news, post-truth events, in which only a small amount of information is provided in a certain description or video, and we can easily be misled by them. There are many other tricks besides the personal attack fallacy and narrative fallacy, such as presenting an authority, but this authority is not necessarily credible, strongly emotional words to distract you and make you ignore relevant reasons and evidence. For example, attacking a scarecrow, that is, distorting the other party's point of view, and attacking this non-existent scarecrow. Another example, random labeling, distraction, circular reasoning, etc. These are all tricks that people may have in their arguments, and we need to learn to identify them dispassionately. Here's what we said. First little reminder, beware of logical fallacies in arguments. The second little reminder is that we have to be careful of those vague words. After listening to other people's speeches, we must accurately identify the exact meaning of the key words in them. If you observe carefully, you will find that even in formal occasions, many people's speeches, some terms are vague and unclear, and there are often some polysemous or ambiguous words, which will lead to his argument is not strong enough. Therefore, when we discuss or communicate by ourselves, we must pay attention to defining and explaining to your audience the ambiguous keywords in our own words. Both words and thoughts need to be polished. Pay attention to this, and your expressions will become more accurate and powerful. A third reminder is that we need to be careful with potentially deceptive data. Nowadays, many people have the inertia of data worship. When a person throws out a data chart that looks very informative, we tend to think that his conclusion is reliable and true. But you have to be careful, the data is not necessarily credible. For example, some data samples may be underrepresented, and some people will omit some information to achieve his purpose. For example, I said that the number of companies in a certain park has increased by 75%. This percentage sounds high, but it may have only increased from 4 to 7 companies. As another example, some people will use inappropriate averages to draw a wrong conclusion. The average includes the mean, mode, and median. There are often statistics and rankings of industry average salaries in data reports, but this ranking using the average may not be very meaningful, because some industries have very bipolar salaries differentiated, its median and mean can vary widely. However, if you want to make the salary level appear high, you may use the average to display it. Therefore, even if the other party unfolds a seemingly reliable data form for us, we must be vigilant, because there may be many pitfalls in the data. One final reminder, beware of what is omitted. In fact, most of the information we encounter in our lives is purposeful, carefully selected, and organized by someone in order to persuade us. In this information, some key information may be omitted, which leads us to make hasty or even wrong judgments, such as the negative effects that are never mentioned in some new product advertisements, such as the use of some faster and thinner products. Concept rather than specific numbers. As critical thinkers, in the face of information provided by others, we need to be able to discover and interrogate those neglected content, because those content may be very important to your decision-making. For example, there is a passage that says this: studies have shown that college students are particularly prone to becoming obese. Obesity rates among college students have been on the rise, according to a recent decade-long study. In 2002, the proportion of obese college students was 25.4%. By 2012, the proportion of obese college students had reached 30.2%. Lack of access to healthy food and increased alcohol consumption are the main reasons why college student obesity is becoming more common, researchers say. This paragraph sounds fine at first glance, but if you think about it, is there any information that has been omitted? For example, are there other aspects that might cause college students to become obese? For example, social and economic development trends, or life pressure. Compared with other social groups, what are the special features of college students that may make them more likely to gain weight? Have these findings been found in other studies? How were study participants selected? How representative is the sample of people who volunteered to participate in the study? The omitted information above may be very important, or it may make the conclusion of this study untenable. In the face of the information provided by others, we should pay attention to discovering and asking about the omitted content. This point is also very useful for us to organize our own discussion. When we organize our own arguments, we can first list those arguments that support and refute our position, which can give us a general idea of what an effective and strong argument may need to contain, thereby helping us deepen our understanding of counterpoints. Understanding, and thus be fully prepared to refine our own discourse. Those are 4 reminders. Beware of logical fallacies in arguments, beware of ambiguous words, beware of data that could deceive you, and beware of things that are omitted. I hope these 4 reminders can help you avoid some thinking traps. Now, let's recap. First of all, critical thinking is not to doubt and criticize everything, but to think, evaluate, and then respond to everything that one hears and sees. Secondly, the basis of critical thinking is not principles, but rich knowledge. Finally, critical thinking critically is not just critical thinking about what others say, it can also be applied to our own speaking and writing. In the actual operation process, whether we are examining other people's arguments or organizing our own viewpoints, first of all, we need to find out the topic before we can make a targeted response. Second, we need to find the reasons and conclusions in the arguments, and identify the assumptions behind them, to judge whether this assumption is tenable. At the conclusion, we need to ensure that the conclusion is clear and accessible, and we can use conditional sentences to avoid dichotomous, black and white conclusions. In addition, I have 4 reminders, namely, beware of logical fallacies in arguments, beware of ambiguous words, deceptive data, and omitted content, hoping to help you avoid those thinking traps. If you want to be a critical thinker, what kind of person do you have to be? There is such a sentence in the book that can answer this question. It says, the fundamental values of a critical thinker are self-determination, curiosity, courtesy, and respect for good argument. This sentence can be used as a footnote for critical thinking and a beacon on our way forward. This is the end of this episode of the show. What do you think about it differently? Welcome to leave a message to discuss with everyone. Hey, if you like our channel, please subscribe us. Haha, remember to like it.